Well, I think we have to start with Brazil. Brazil is an extraordinary country, and when I think about Brazil today, it is Brazil's moment in time. It has changed quite dramatically since became the president 6 years ago. He is a labor leader who has come in and implemented a macroeconomic model, a very conservative macroeconomic model that put a great deal of emphasis on a sound fiscal approach. He reduced inflation quite dramatically. And he has created, through his policies, a boom in the country. And this comes from a whole bunch of things. Number one, he proved that a labor leader can come in and implement a series of rational economic policies. He has created an environment where, in Brazil's history, there's always been a huge amount of volatility around growth. So one year you grow 5% or 6%, the next year you don't grow at all. And what President Lula said from the very beginning is, I want to create an environment where we get steady growth. So I'm looking for a country which will grow 4 or 5% every year forever, give or take a little bit at the edges. I'm not interested in a country that has volatile growth. And I'm not interested in a country that has high inflation, because high inflation is the biggest tax you can possibly have on people. And so he pursued a series of policies, and he brought his party along with him. So if you look at Brazil, it's got a number of states which are larger than most of the other countries in Latin America. And all of these states have elected governors, and so he has all of these, the depth and breadth of future political leaders behind him. And from his economic policies, you've seen a capital markets develop. Between the period of, I guess, 2004 and 2007, there have been 100 IPOs. Before that, there were none. You've seen him reduce poverty by over 31%. And you've seen him take, if you look at the demographics of the country, when he became president in, I guess, 2002 at this point, you had about 21 or 22% in the A demographic. Today you have about 23%. In the the A's and B's. In the C demographic, you had approximately 20-some%. Today you have 49%. And in the D's and E's, you had 40-some%, and today you have 20-some%. So what he's done is he's taken a huge number of the D's and E's and moved them into a middle-class society, defined in Brazil as someone who earns between $450 and $750 a month. He's also reduced the number of jobs in the informal economy and moved them to the formal economy, and which has made enormous difference. And he has really focused on the very poorest. So there are about 11 million families that are in the Bolsa de Familia, which is actually a payment that he makes to different families. So he's really changed. Foreign direct investment just in the last year has gone from something like $19 billion to $37 billion, 2006 to 2007. And if you talk to companies, it's all of a sudden the most interesting place for companies to invest. Why? Because there's so many common cultural, you can see the commonalities culturally that maybe you don't see when you go to India, or you don't see when you go to China, but you see them in Brazil. And his foreign policy has grown alongside of it too. Well, I think it's across the board. First of all, you look at the auto industry. In this country, we've had a decline. Our auto companies are having many challenges, let's say, in this kind of environment. Interestingly enough, the most innovative plant that Ford has is in Brazil. And if you think about it, so you see a whole bunch of things happening. You see cars, automobiles, you see energy, you see infrastructure, because one of the things that's keeping Brazil from being even more competitive is a lack of infrastructure. Trains, roads, ports, navigation to get the products to the ports, agriculture. Brazil has the capacity to be the breadbasket of the world, frankly, if they could grow the product and get it to a port and then be able to transport it around the world. You're seeing people, the consumer market, Brazil's got a huge market, and off the back of this steady growth and what's happening in Brazil today has been the rise of the middle class, the rise of the consumer. So more people have access to technology. They have a more advanced banking technology system than, frankly, we do in this country. They vote by internet in Brazil. They have there's more access to credit cards. There's a boom because with low inflation and steady growth, people have credit cards, they're buying homes, they can get mortgages, they can get car loans. So there's this whole middle class that all of a sudden is growing and has the opportunity to buy and be a consumer. That's very attractive for companies to come and invest. Look at Walmart. Walmart's a huge investor in Brazil today. So I can go on and on. Interestingly enough, in energy, it's not just the fact that with these deep water finds, Petrobras with the deep water finds has the potential to be the 5th largest producer of traditional energy in the world. But Brazil, unlike, frankly, even the United States, has pursued a 20-year energy strategy. Because if you go back to the debt crisis in the 1980s, Brazil didn't have enough energy. And so this was one of many issues, right? But one of the issues. And so they put forward a 20-year or 30-year energy strategy, which today is paying off. It's the only country in the world where 48% of all gasoline consumed is ethanol based, and 48% is more traditional gasoline based. That doesn't exist anyplace else in the world. So if Petrobras actually, they get these deep water finds, it could be the 5th largest producer of traditional energy in the world. It's really very interesting. And you see all of this, for example, reflecting itself in the Doha round and how Celso Amorim, who's the foreign minister, and President Lula have conducted themselves in a really an amazingly constructive way in terms of the G20. Even when it came down to the final moments, they voted against their friends in Mercosur in a very responsible way to open up the domestic markets, because one of the big discussions is not just reducing the agricultural subsidies in the United States and in Europe, but it's then how do you open up the domestic markets in Brazil, China, India, Argentina, the industrial market, and reduce the tariffs and allow countries like the United States to export into those markets industrialized goods without a tariff. Well, I think that's one of the really very interesting, I would say, passages of how the United States and Brazil have built the relationship. In some ways, the relationship with Brazil has moved to a relationship of mutual understanding and respect, where the Brazilian government and the U.S. government work on a number of different fronts together. And one of the places that really paved the way for that kind of relationship is the not the exportation so much of ethanol, but the exportation of technology, the Brazilian technology of ethanol, to countries like the Caribbean, to countries like Central America, to other countries in South America. That's one of the big pillars that's moving forward jointly to try to export the technology. The sugar-based, because remember, in the U.S., we produce ethanol with corn. In Brazil, they produce ethanol with sugar, which is far more efficient than corn, which is why we don't want Brazilian-based ethanol exported into the United States. I think it's helping alternative energy around the world. And I think that Brazil, an emerging economy, a BRIC, being so advanced in this space, frankly, I think is a role model for many other countries to follow. in terms of the creation of alternative energy sources. And you know, it's also, as I said, paved the way for many things that the U.S. I mean, if you think about Brazil, they've also taken a leadership role in Haiti. They're working on a number of disease projects with the United States and Africa. They're working in some African countries to reduce malaria together. You know, Brazil, I think one of the other things they've done is take a real leadership role in South America. In President Lula's own very quiet leadership way. If I can say something about my own organization, on Monday night, this coming Monday night when President Lula's in New York, we will give him a gold insignia, which is our highest medal that we only give to democratically elected leaders in the hemisphere. And our board unanimously agreed that he deserves this medal for everything. I mean, he's really, in my view, he has built upon what President Fernando Henrique Cardoso started, because President Enrique Cardoso started you know, implementing all of the macroeconomic framework that exists today, but President Lula really took it to another level. And so he has really, during his administration, I would say Brazil has just transformed itself and the country is just at a different level. And one final comment on Brazil, which I think is very important, is that there are a lot of other things that need to happen. There are still a lot of reforms that need to happen. And they go to, they need reform, fiscal reform, you know, the absolute, one of the reasons the informal economy continues to boom in Brazil is that the non-payroll percentage of wages is something like 37 or 39%, one of the highest in the world. So they need fiscal reform tax reform in Brazil. They're working on tax treaties with, for example, the United States. They need political reform because it's still a very splintered party system. They still need additional fiscal reform. Their judicial reform, there are all kinds of reform. But what's really interesting about Brazil is you can go in and you can talk to a number of the ministers and they list what needs to happen. And one of the things that's also very interesting about Brazil, as you see each one of these reforms happening, you see an additional half a point or point on GDP growth over the long term. So you can see how Brazil can go from a 4% growth rate to a 7% growth rate through real reform. And then they'll also say, but it might not happen under President Lula. It'll happen under another president, because everything happens the way, it kind of moves it the way Brazil needs to make it move to build the kind of consensus they need in the country. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about Brazil. It's also become investment grade this year. And that's not just off of the economics, but it's also, again, off the political institutions and the depth and the breadth of the potential political leaders in the country. I think that, yes, there is still a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. But I would also argue that the only way that you can reduce that real poverty is through sustained economic growth, low inflation over a long period of time, and through job creation and giving people real jobs. And I think that President Lula has done that. And through the Bolsa Familia, he's trying to raise and support the lower end of the spectrum. One of the other things that he's doing is he spends about 4% of GDP on education, which is more than India, more than China. So he needs to bring a whole new class level of education to people. And that education is very tricky. It's trickier than we think. We were having lunch with the mayor of one of the big states, or one of the cities in one of the big states, and he was explaining that they have put in place a program where they bring children to school, and normally children come to school and they're clean and they're dressed, but from the very poor states where people are living in slums with no running water, etc., the children are coming dirty, unfed, etc. And so what they're doing is they've implemented a program where they bring the children to school, they give them baths, they dress them, they feed them 3 meals a day, and now they're going back into the homes of the children and helping the parents also learn about what the children have learned in school. So you know, there are issues, but you can only tackle, in my opinion, these issues piece by piece by understanding what they are. The disparity exists. It's absolutely clear. But I think, and it is a huge challenge, but I think that the kinds of policies they're implementing, which is, you know, create jobs, create education. The other thing that's interesting about Brazil is, of all emerging markets, Brazil has more corporate social responsibility, has some of the best examples of corporate social responsibility that exist in Latin America and other emerging markets. And so, you know, there are a number of educational programs from the private sector, not to pay teachers more, but to, you know, really enhance the level of education. If you go to bookstores today in Brazil that would have been empty or didn't exist, they're, you know, children reading corners. So I think you have to change a culture. It takes time, and but the disparity exists. I think they deserve a greater role at the United Nations. I think that, you know, in a world that's changing today from an economic power base, political power base, I think we have to relook who sits on a number of different things. I don't think it's just the United Nations. I think, you know, we have to rethink all of the Bretton Woods institutions in the United Nations that were created after World War II, where you had Japan and, you know, certain European countries in the United States coming out as being the powers. I think over time, as economic power shifts, we've got to look at what does that mean across a whole series of institutions, and the United Nations as well. I mean, I think the United Nations is very interesting because even if I said yes, and let's say I was Secretary of State or something, which I'll never be, but you know what I'm trying to say, many Latin American countries would disagree that Brazil should have a seat at the Security Council. So it's hard for Latin American countries themselves to agree. I mean, why not give it to Mexico? It's also an emerging power, if you think about it. And different set of issues than exist in Brazil today, but an emerging power. Why not give the seat to Chile? Small country, but, you know, very responsible. Look at what's happening in Colombia or Peru or other countries. And so I think it's very hard for the Latin Americans themselves to say who should have a permanent seat, or should they have a permanent seat, and should it be Brazil? I don't really think that Venezuela is a rising power. I think Venezuela has a lot of oil wealth, which they choose to spend in a number of different ways. Interestingly enough, unlike Brazil, which is spending a lot of its wealth internally on infrastructure, on making lives for ordinary Brazilians better, on creating a macroeconomic environment where people have access to a job and a good life, President Chavez is not really doing any of those things. He is producing oil, he's selling oil, he's spending a great deal of money abroad, he's building alliances, but you know, he's got a country with, I would guess, 30-some%, maybe more inflation, with a growth that's off of the oil money. He's not creating jobs. If you go back, you know, 6 or 9 months, he had shortages of food. A country that rich to have shortages of food is a little bit, if you think about it, outrageous. He's giving money away, which is fine, but I don't think he's really creating jobs and necessarily a better life for Brazilians and for Venezuelans. And so I don't think you are a rising power. You become a rising power when you build a society within your country that supports being a power. What makes the United States a power And what made us a power coming out of World War II was our growth in our domestic market and the wealth of the individual Americans, and the fact that everybody had a job and everybody had a house and everybody had a car, and we're paying for some of that right now, but that's what made, and creating an environment where innovation was, we're the most innovative society in the world. That's how you create a power. I think Brazil is on that path. If you look at, we talked about innovation, they do agricultural innovation, they do innovation for ethanol, they're doing innovation, they're an innovative society across, and a very entrepreneurial society. It's a little hard to open businesses, but lots of entrepreneurs, lots of people opening businesses, et cetera. In some ways very similar to the United States. I don't think Venezuela has those characteristics. So they have influence because they have money, but that doesn't mean that they're becoming a power, because they're not becoming powerful within the country. Well, I think we can all speculate. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time speculating on Cuba and what a post-Fidel Cuba would look like, because in a sense Fidel is still alive and he's not ruling it, but many of the reforms that Raul's put in place are more of a form of a reform than an actual deep reform. I think that the biggest reform, if you really want to see change in Cuba, I think we have to look to when they and we in the United States open up and allow more information about what a better life for Cubans looks like, because I think that's how you create real change. But I would be hopeful that there will be some transition which would allow more freedom for Cubans, more opportunity for Cubans, maybe moving towards some type of democratically elected government post Raul that's more market-based. I think that our policy, the United States' policy towards Cuba, my guess is there'll be some change in whatever and whoever the next administration is, although I think it probably depends who's elected, what kind of change and how much change. But there's a new generation of Cuban American in Miami, and I think they would like to see, or many of them, not all of them, but some of them, would like to see a change in our policy as well. Because if we, for example, were to allow more travel, more exchange, then potentially you could also see more Cubans understanding why more freedom would be a good thing.